Good morning, everybody. This is Stephen Pugh of the Home Bible College. I want to do another episode in my book on the on my series on the King James Bible, and we're going to be thinking today. It's chapter 12 of the book by Alistair McGrath. In the beginning, the story of the King James Bible, and I'm going to highlight various points as we go along. By 1850, the King James translation had triumphed. What was only a curiosity at one stage had now become a classic, and the 19th century showered praise on the King James Bible, viewing it as one of the high points of English literary achievement, and perhaps the greatest contribution to the spiritual ennobling of the human race. Such judgments are inevitably projected onto earlier generations, giving the impression that the genius and the brilliance of the translation were universally recognized from the outset. Now, history gives us no warrant for any such extravagant opinions. Indeed, the evidence at our disposal suggests that many saw the final appearance of the new translation as something of an anticlimax. There were those who would indeed speak of the King James Bible in the highest possible terms, but such a judgment would lay over a century away. The irrefutable evidence is that far from rushing out to buy and make use of the new translation, people preferred to use an English translation from 50 years earlier, the Geneva Bible. The simple truth was that the new Bible was initially regarded with polite disinterest. Nobody at the time really liked the new translation very much. Even some of those who were prominently involved in the translation of the King James Bible seemed hesitant to use it, preferring to cite from the Geneva Bible instead, hardly a commendation for their own work. The King James Bible might be the Bible for the English religious and political establishment. It had a long way to go before it became the Bible of the English people. Now, the early reactions were varied. The publication of the King James Bible in 1611 occasioned no fanfares of welcome and no accolades of praise. The event caused scarcely a ripple to pass over the face of English society at the time, and England had far more important things to worry about than its new Bible. There were religious controversies that were hot about the question of predestination in the Low Countries. It was beginning to have an influence in England, and there became an increased religious polarization on this issue. Politically, there were concerns about Spanish ambitions in the Low Countries, which could easily involve England in a new military conflict. The small degree of reaction that could be discerned was generally negative in tone. One response was particularly critical and deserves mention. When the translators of the King James Bible were selected, some individuals who believed that they were highly suited for the task had been passed over. One scholar who saw himself as belonging to this category, who was overlooked for his genius, was Hugh Broughton, 1549 to 1612. Broughton had pressed the case for a new translation of the Bible during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Contemporary reports suggest that Broughton was a notoriously grumpy old man who disliked working with others and had an exaggerated sense of his own importance. And so having such a prima donna to work together in a committee was going to be very difficult. He was himself heavily involved in a biblical translation project of his own choosing, which was a revision of the Geneva Bible. This revision was never completed. Broughton himself professed himself to be cross at the new translation and declared that the only useful thing that could be done with it was to use it for lighting fires. Broughton's death in 1612 prevented him from developing his criticisms to the new translation. However, there were others who were displeased with the new translation as well, and they sought to secure revisions of the King James Bible, even at the earliest possible stage. Now, the King James Bible had been commissioned by a king, okay? And as parliamentarians, there were those who argued for the authority of the English Parliament over the king. Okay, and this attitude gained influence around the time, and the question should be: should the new translation be authorized by the king or by Parliament? That's a great debate, you see, that arrived at that time. The parliamentarians were mainly Puritan, and Puritanism during the reign of Charles I, they did all they could to eliminate the influence of the Bible with its marginal notes. Now, so we have what's called the Battle of the Bibles, Charles I and the war against the Geneva Bible. Now, Charles I, as a result of the authorities, after 1616, the printing of the Geneva Bible ceased in England. The work now had to be imported from the Netherlands. This, however, did nothing to stem its sales. It still sold in huge numbers as opposed to the King James Bible. However, with the death of James I and the ascension of his son Charles I in 1625, saw a change in the religious climate within England. Now, Charles's marriage to the French princess Henrietta Maria had caused considerable popular resentment, partly on account of her being a foreigner and partly because she was Roman Catholic. Charles appointed a high churchman called William Laud as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1633. Now, Archbishop Laud was clearly troubled by the continuing popularity and the high sales of the Geneva Bible. And what happened was there became a polarization between the Puritans and the Anglicans. Now, the Puritans preferred the Geneva Bible and the Anglicans preferred the King James Bible. What would happen very soon was that there would be a civil war that would break out. It would be Puritan against Anglican. It would be parliamentarian against loyalists. And the Geneva Bible with its notes was seen as the Bible of the Puritans, and the King James Bible that of the establishment. It was not the Geneva translation that the English king and Lord in particular had problems with. It was with the marginal notes. It was the notes that accompanied the Bible as explanations. The Genevan Bible, dated from 2 generations earlier, was critical of the monarchical powers. And therefore Charles I was going to be dead against it. He felt threatened by the Geneva challenge to the doctrine of the divine right of kings. Now, all that was needed in order to ban the Geneva Bible was an edict from the king. To support the Geneva Bible, he argued, was unpatriotic. So it wasn't so much that he needed to ban it. He just had to insinuate that this was French or that this was Swiss and it was not properly British, and that would be suffice. So the Geneva Bibles were printed in Amsterdam. They were far better in every respect than the early printings of the King James Bible, and if market forces alone were going to be allowed to dictate the outcome, then the Geneva Bible would dominate the English market for sure. It may be added that the costliness of the King James Bible was a direct result of Robert Barker's monopoly of the text. Okay, so this was going to be a problem. The final edition of the Geneva Bible in England was published in 1644. As a result, the King James Bible enjoyed a new commercial success. The word popularity was not going to be a word that would be used for quite a century later. So the popularity of the Geneva Bible rested not so much on the translation, but on the explanatory material attached. Between 1642 and 1715, at least 9 editions, of the King James Bible came out. They were known, some of them were known as the King James Bible with the Geneva Notes. So you can see how very valuable people put value on the notes that accompanied the Bible. Now, eventually, in the closing years of Charles I's reign, the growing political influence of Puritanism began to become important to the reception of the King James Bible. Parliament, it was argued, should commission a new translation which would eliminate the errors and the ecclesiastical bias of the King James Bible. Now notice that there were lots of errors in the King James Bible. So this idea that it was the perfect, pure word of God is just a complete fallacy. It absolutely has no basis in truth. They wanted to commission a new translation to eliminate all the errors of the King James Bible and also the ecclesiastical bias. This was a translation that was written specifically to give a bias to the Church of England and to promote the idea of bishops and archbishops, and also to promote the standing of the king. In 1641, Laud was finally imprisoned in the Tower of London, and in 1645 he was executed. With Laud out of the way, serious opposition to the King James Bible gathered momentum. John Lightfoot was one who argued for a revision, an early revision, as soon as possible, of the King James Bible. And complaints against the King James Bible could broadly be described in 2 categories. First of all, there were the many misprints in the printed version of the text, which caused a lot of confusion to readers, and perhaps more seriously, questioning concerning the accuracy of the translation. So there were 2 issues there. There were the many mistakes, and there was questions about how accurate the translation was. Now a parliamentary group was crystallized around Henry Jesse in 1601 to 1663, noted for his competence in sacred languages. The particular point that the parliamentary group argued against is the King James use of the prelatical language. Now, what we mean by that is the use of church terminology to bolster the system of the Church of England of having bishops and archbishops and all the different levels of authority. There was also new and increased resistance from many Puritans to the inclusion of the Apocrypha in the King James Bible. In the first year of the Commonwealth, an edition of the King James Bible with the Geneva Notes was published with official backing in London. It was called and then there was the Soldier's Pocket Bible, issued in 1643, which consisted of selections from the Geneva Bible. The following year saw the final reprint of the Geneva Bible, which henceforth virtually disappeared from the radar screens of the English religious controversy. Now, when Oliver Cromwell came to power, he conferred the monopoly on the King James Bible to John Field and Henry Hills in 1656, during which year Field also became printer at Cambridge University. The monopoly of the King James Bible sought to discourage the publication of rival versions and of the development of revisions. With the waning popularity of the Geneva Bible at the time, it might have been expected that the King James Version would have a surge of popularity. Oliver Cromwell was installed as Lord Protector of the English nation in December 1653 and failed to ensure the Puritan succession. So at his death in 1658, 5 years later, it led to the Puritan government being overthrown. Falling apart is a better phrase. The resulting instability eventually led to the restoration of the monarch in 1660 with Charles II. Now, on the restoration, this was the time when the King James Version finally had acceptance, or should we say, it was bulldozed into acceptance. So, with the restoration of Charles II in 1660, it put an end to any talk about revising the King James translation or replacing it with a revival. The publication of the Book of Common Prayer in 1662, alongside the King James translation of the Bible, was designed to ensure religious conformity and security so that the problems of the past might be left behind, and the King James Bible was now seen to be a pillar of the Restoration Society, holding together church and state and bishops and monarch at a time when social cohesion was essential to England's future as a nation. And the Act of Uniformity in 1662, which brought a new Book of Common Prayer. This was the church service that was imposed upon every parish in England. Nobody wanted to return to the chaos of the Puritan Commonwealth, and England turned its back on Puritanism as quickly and as totally as Germany disowned its Nazi past after the Second World War. It always amazes me how a whole population can switch allegiances, important allegiances, sometimes overnight. With the restoration of the monarchy to popular acclaim, the Battle of the Bibles had ended and the King James Bible had finally triumphed over its rival. And notice, it didn't triumph over its rival because it was better. It wasn't better. Everybody knew it wasn't better. Everybody knew that it was dire need of revision. Everybody knew that there were so many mistakes that had to be corrected. And everybody knew that it was slanted towards the nobility and to the king and to the bishops. Everybody knew that. Everybody knew that the new translation was absolutely essential. So the new translation, as the King James Bible was said, people talk about modern translations, but the King James Bible was a modern translation in those days, was still termed even late in the 17th century, and was still regarded with some misgivings even in the 18th century. The next 150 years were characterized by something of times approaching uncritical adulation. The King James Bible 150 years later became a matter of something that was sacrosanct. It had to be honored and it had to be glorified. Familiarity dulled the senses of the weakness of the translation. The translation was actually quite weak. It wasn't particularly popular because of that. People were already educated by reading the Bishop's Bible or the Geneva Bible, and yet the triumph of the King James Bible was not limited just to Great Britain. The Authorized Version, as we call it here, with the expansion of the British economic and military influence in the later 18th and 19th century, it was preceded and accompanied by missionary work based on the King James Bible. And the impact of the King James Bible on the language and worship of Christianity in Africa and Australia was immense. Okay, so the King James Bible also had another influence. It had an influence in America. The English language was brought to America by English colonists who began to settle in the region in the late 16th century. Several waves of European immigration led to Dutch, French, German, Italian, Spanish, and Swedish becoming established, often in very specific geographical regions. The emergence of English as the dominant and finally the official language of the United States is a fascinating and complex matter and cannot be told in detail in this chapter. But it is significant in demonstrating the influence of the King James Bible on the shaping of written and spoken English in America. Now, there were three stages in European settlement in North America. I can't go into all of those details just now, but suffice to say that Johnstown was founded in 1607. Okay, and the American colonists had strong religious reasons for wishing to leave England. Many of them were persecuted in England, especially the Puritans were persecuted in England, and these emigres brought their Bible with them to the New World. Now, we need to remember that in America, in the early days, for quite a long time actually, for about 100 years, the only main books that were available were King James Bibles. It wasn't possible to set up the printing systems that were necessary in America in the early days, and sometimes the only book that was found in a house, a typical house, was just a King James Bible. And often it was a large version, and often it was an early version of the King James Bible, full of all its typographical and translation errors and misunderstandings. The standard American English in many ways resembled the spoken English of the 17th and 18th century. Phrases like "I guess" or nouns such as "platter" and verbal forms such as "gotten," all of which date back to Chaucer before the King James Version was ever conceived. They dropped out of use in England, but they were retained in America. People in England have this misunderstanding, thinking that these words like "gotten" and "plattered" and "I guess," that they were phrases that were invented by the Americans. They weren't. They were phrases that were given to them from England, but in England we stopped using those expressions. Other languages might predominate in certain localities, but English was the predominant language spoken throughout the New World, mainly because of the presence of the King James Bible. The literary text that shaped American Christianity in its formation proved to be the King James Bible. So the faith and the language nourished and governed by the King James translation. Noah Webster famously said that the language of the Bible has no inconsiderable influence in forming and preserving the national language. Now, it took quite some time, but eventually there came a problem that they needed to print their own American Bibles in America. And the King James Bible could not be produced legally in America and had to be imported from England. The reason for this is because the English Crown kept the copyright, and nobody was allowed to produce a copy of the King James Bible without paying a huge monopoly fee for the privilege of being a printer. It took a long time in America for printing to finally come to the fore. And eventually, when a person called John Eliot, who came from England, when he went to America, he began, along with Thomas Hooker, to start to print. He was a printer himself. He understood printing very well, and he began to print. And guess what he tried to print first? He tried to print the Bible. He set up a society for the propagation of the gospel in New England, and his translation and production of the Bible took over for a period of time. The first complete Bible was published in America in a European language, appeared in 1743, but it was not, as we might think, an English translation. It was a German translation reflecting the sizable German community in America. The American Revolution witnessed the overthrow of British power, and this broke the chain. An American edition of the King James Bible, which was free of any restrictions which had proved earlier, now was able to be printed. Robert Aitken, who was born in Scotland in 1735, where he had learned the craft of book production, he established himself in the book trade in Paisley in Scotland. However, In 1769, the family moved to Philadelphia, where he established himself as a bookseller and consequently as a printer and a publisher. He set up his printing house at the sign of the Pope's Head, only a few doors away from the coffee house, and he began to print. But one of the things that they did is they began to print Bibles. That was the big thing. He did not wait for congressional approval before beginning his work, and the text to be printed was, of course, the King James Bible. But being American, he wished to omit the Apocrypha. This reduced the cost very considerably. Aitken promptly inserted the congressional endorsement at the front of his Bibles, even though it wasn't given at that time. But authorization soon followed, and his Bible did not have the impact that he'd hoped for. The end of hostilities with England led to the opening of trade routes, and the result was that imported Bibles from Britain and Europe were now much more available at considerably lower cost than what Aitken could produce them. He, at one particular stage, sought Congress to give him an exclusive license to print Bibles, but this was not the spirit of America, and they believed in free enterprise. As rival translations, such as the Revised Standard Version, which began to gain the upper hand in the period immediately following the Second World War, a staunch defense of the integrity of the King James Bible was mounted by its supporters in the United States, and they argued that the King James Bible was more accurate as a translation and was based on a more reliable text than its rivals, and used somber and sober language appropriate to such a dignified topic. A series of popular poetical works argued that the King James Bible alone presented the authentic Word of God. In other words, all other versions of the Bible were distortions, additions, and other changes detrimental to the readability of the text. The production of the New King James Bible, which appeared in the period of 1979 to 82, it can be seen as an attempt to build on the previous strengths of the traditional translation, including its quality of translation and the majesty of style, although perhaps allowing itself to be understood as a new edition of the King James Bible. The work is actually a revision of the text, trying to keep something of the style and the beauty of the original. In popular Christian culture, the King James Bible is seen to possess a dignity and authority that the modern translations somehow fail to convey. But this is based upon prejudice. Using old words and using grand words does not make any translation a better translation. It just makes it sound more pompous and more upper class. That's the point. So that's the end of the last chapter of that part of that book that we've been reviewing. We're going to look at the afterword. We're going to look at what happened after these events. But later I'm going to do a conclusion. I'm going to draw together all the salient points that we've discovered in our tracing of its history, and then finally we're going to review a book that I wrote myself on the King James Bible, or shall I say a commentary on the preface of the King James Bible. We might even review the preface to the Revised Standard Version, and we might review the preface to the New International Version. Both of these prefaces are very salient and very important in understanding the story of the King James Bible. So we look forward to catching up with you on our next episode. Have a wonderful day. Bye for now.